Hello, everyone, and welcome to Identifying and Evaluating Carbon Reduction Opportunities During Due Diligence. My name is Chris Loftman, Vice President of Sustainability at Conservice. I'm sure you have seen the increased demand for ESG integration, along with the need to provide a response to the climate crisis. And when combined with ever-changing market dynamics and shifting consumer preferences, the push for carbon reduction is stronger than ever. Those organizations that begin adopting carbon reduction strategies and goals earlier in their business processes are going to have an advantage in mitigating long-term risk, adhering to compliance requirements, and strengthening their portfolio performance. If your organization has committed to reducing their impact, our topic today addresses an important component that a plan for can accelerate your ability to hit those goals. We will discuss strategies for identifying carbon reduction opportunities during the due diligence process and why that is important. We'll review some trends, and we'll examine the role and impact of ESG across the investment lifecycle. This is one of those topics that if you plan ahead now, before your next acquisition, it will make the process more thorough, allowing you to more clearly identify your risks and take advantage of opportunities. Now, before we jump into the topic, I do have just a couple of housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. The recording and slide deck will be distributed to everyone after the session. Second, the webinar should run for about 45 minutes, and we'll try to save 5 to 10 minutes or so for questions at the end. But if you have questions at any point during the webinar, you can submit it on the GoToWebinar control panel in the questions section. We'll attempt to answer as many questions as we can, but if we don't get to all of them, members of our team will follow up after the webinar to provide answers. Now that we've covered those, let's introduce today's speakers. Marta Shantz is the Senior Vice President at the Urban Land Institute. Kylie Ford is a Principal ESG Consultant for our Gobi team here at Conservice. And Michelle German, a Director of ESG and Sustainability at LBA Realty. With that, let's get started with Marta to lay a foundation of why ESG is important in the due diligence process.
Terrific. Thank you, Chris. And hi, everyone. My name, as Chris mentioned, is Marta Shantz. I'm a Senior Vice President with the Urban Land Institute, and I'm really happy to be here today. This is a bit of a wonky topic, but really impactful and really important in today's world. So happy to be here. For folks who aren't familiar with ULI or the Urban Land Institute, a quick background is that we are a real estate industry group. We have over 45,000 members across the globe with the mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide, which really means we're looking at real estate, we're looking at land use in a meaningful way. Now, the team that I run in particular is called Greenprint, like a blueprint for green buildings, if you will. It's part of ULI's research arm, and we focus on climate mitigation, making that business case for green buildings by tying reductions in carbon to increases in asset value. And so you can see here on this summary slide, we do a good bit of research and technical assistance, looking at everything from sustainable tenant fit outs to embodied carbon to net zero and beyond, climate policy and more. And we also, the center section there around membership, we have a worldwide alliance of leading real estate owners and partners committed to improving the environmental performance of their own portfolios and the broader industry. And so LBA is one of our Greenprint real estate members. Gobi is one of our data partners. So it's a nice family on this webinar today. And the history of Greenprint is pretty cool. That kind of sets the stage for our discussion today. So I'm going to share that quickly. In 2009, a handful of leading real estate owners went to Greenland, truly, saw the glaciers melting, decided they wanted to do something about it. So they formed this collaborative to have shared goals of carbon emissions reductions, shared best practices to collaborate, not compete, and shared accountability to report on their progress over time and hold each other accountable. And we still hold true to those tenets today. So as part of that community, part of that membership effort, we have a lot of topics that we discuss that are important to the sector to drive decarbonization and drive that business case. And one of those that we had a little while back is around the importance of ESG, environmental, social, and governance in due diligence. What are companies working on? What are they struggling with? What are some recent innovations that have worked for folks? And we actually on the back end ended up putting together a list of best of ESG elements in due diligence for our Greenprint real estate members, which informed a lot of my talking points today. ultimately, this is all about addressing the value of potential acquisitions through that lens of ESG, environmental social governance. Real estate leaders very much recognize this need to codify language around ESG, create consistent processes, and have those be inherited by stakeholders across the entire deal lifecycle, which is no easy feat. And so during due diligence, a lot of folks had been seeing that there just wasn't as much focus in that acquisitions team as there was on the asset management side of things. So a real opportunity to make a difference there. And so historically, the trend might have been that the responsibility would fall on asset managers to integrate goals and ESG strategies and beyond, but the asset managers will look up and say, at their budget, this wasn't planned for. We didn't know about this. And so that disconnect is something that can really be addressed to optimize things. And that's what we're looking at here with this importance of ESG in due diligence. The idea that you want a commitment to get through that first layer of ESG integration features. They'll eventually go into someone else's business plan, right? The asset manager, the property manager, whoever's taking that lead seat. But they also then have this backseat driver saying, we need to fulfill commitments. We need to meet a public goal, create more dialogue, meet with stakeholders, understand the incentives and the ability and willingness of the broader team. And all of that, believe it or not, can be incorporated in due diligence if you set your minds to it. So we see the value broken out into 3 sections. Data, first and foremost. I mean, I feel like I say this every day, but you can't manage what you don't measure. And so if you don't have that baseline understanding of performance of the asset, it's really hard to set yourself up for success and be able to set goals from that baseline. The second piece is around success and looking at the opportunity for incorporating ESG early on, setting up not only the asset itself, but the broader portfolio for success against expectations and goals, whether it be at the specific building level or at a corporate level. That also kind of leans into the risk of not doing this, and that's around future proofing against climate risks, both physical risks and transition risks, and thinking about that risk management, whether it's because of climate policies coming up at the local level, whether it's because of stakeholder expectations at the local level, thinking about that green premium, that brown discount, and how that all plays into things. So we can look at the positive, we can look at the risk, but altogether this just really leads to the need to include ESG in due diligence. A lot of companies have been putting together a due diligence checklist for a very long time. And so adding ESG elements into that, you think, oh, no big deal, it'll be really easy, until you start making that list. And the bullets on here are just a few examples of the topics that could be included in an ESG due diligence checklist. For someone getting just started, I wouldn't recommend throwing everything in there at once. That would probably be a bit overwhelming for the deal team. But ultimately, this is the type of information that you would want to look at when you're thinking about what elements of ESG should go in a DD, due diligence assessment. Some of these details are already included, like property attributes, the square footage, the size, the location, things of that nature. But then you get into other questions about regulatory details, for example. And I'm not going to speak to each of these bullets. That would take the whole webinar. But I will just do a few. And one of those is that regulatory piece, where if you're not looking at ESG, maybe you end up having your company acquire a flagship building in a major metropolitan area. But if you're not thinking about how the climate policies, whether it's a benchmarking ordinance, building performance standard, audit requirement, Energy Star scored, labeling system, whatever those climate policies may be on the operation side of things, there could be a real disconnect between the value and the perceived and the actual value during operations. So thinking about those regulatory details is one example of a real valuable type of thing to have as foresight, as opposed to hindsight being 2020. I mean, this applies globally too. If you think about Europe with their energy performance certificates and other regulations elsewhere, this is a big one. We also start thinking about climate risk. And when you're trying to put climate risk into underwriting, which I think Kylie's going to speak about a good bit, so I won't go into too much detail, but leaning into those mitigants for risk like climate risk, if you're slamming asset managers later with the need to protect buildings from flooding, for example, but it wasn't planned for early on, it's just a real missed opportunity not to build that in, put it in front of the investment committee, make sure that all of those risks are covered. And so starting to include not just the kind of traditional green building type of ESG elements into due diligence, but also the climate risk side of things can be a real value add as well. Another piece that's important to think about is tenants, for example, and a number of the bullets on here are specific to those end customers. And it's not just your investment partners, but it's the folks who live and breathe and work and play in these commercial and multifamily buildings. And so it ramps up the criticality, especially with COVID and how occupants are being more attentive to the buildings that used to be invisible to them, that it's important to think about. And so when we think about how tenants are becoming more and more vocal with their interests and starting to show that with their wallet, it's something that can help convince the acquisitions team and broader real estate colleagues that you may not get the tenants you want if we don't invest in ESG, right? A great product is sustainable. And so marble finishes in the lobby are lovely, and those are also an aesthetic value add, but thinking about the value add from the tenant perspective from ESG is a big piece as well. So whether that's tenant engagement, tenant amenities, tenant health and well-being, sub-meters to understand tenant energy usage, those type of tenant specific pieces are useful to include in an ESG due diligence assessment. And then the last one I just want to speak to is around green property condition assessments. More often than not, you'll have a PCA during an acquisition process, but it's not always a green one. And so rather than having someone come back to the site for a second time and conduct an energy audit and look at the physical climate risk and those type of details, having it all integrated into one process is very efficient and very helpful in the timing side of things to make sure that those inspections think about the different ESG considerations that are important to your firm. So whether that's looking at the equipment in the building like Energy Star appliances, efficient lighting fixtures, and being able to have kind of an action plan for the next 3 to 5 years or the ownership term of the asset can make a big difference. A lot of times the more prescriptive it is, the better, specifically looking at variable frequency drives on motors and fans, or what improvement needs to be made to the central mechanical plant, chiller age, all sorts of those kind of specifics, they help. More data is good. Granted, more data, as well as all of these additions, take time. And that's the biggest challenge about integrating ESG into due diligence, just the speed of the deal. From an acquisitions perspective, the moment you get any sort of attention on ESG, everything is moving so quickly. You want to get a return on investment figures for specific features you want incorporated for underwriting, but it's hard to get those estimates and numbers quickly. And you can try and create guidelines so things get flagged, but getting those hard and fast numbers, it's tough to do during that really fast deal. And so I want to acknowledge that if this were easy, everyone would already be doing it, but that should not stop folks from realizing that this is important and start the process if they haven't yet. Thinking about there is not only a cost to this, but there's also a value creation component for mitigating both physical and transition risk. And so there are a lot of ways to show that value and make it worthwhile to incorporate it in that deal. So I will pause there. I'll pass it back to Chris to take us to the next speaker.
Thanks, Marta. You're absolutely correct. I mean, the compressed time period does really present a challenge, but it's also the one time that you actually have the attention of the seller. And if you plan ahead, kind of as you're talking about, and you have a game plan before it starts, you think about things like asking for historical billing data, maybe access to the Energy Star portfolio manager. You're going to be much more successful when you ask for those things before you close than after you close. I would like to dive a little deeper into how climate risk is integrated into due diligence. Kylie, do you want to take us there?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Marta, for that wonderful overview of ESG integrations. It's funny because climate risk people think is a very narrow piece of ESG often, but it really does bleed over into a lot of the areas that you touched on already. So just as someone who works as a consultant in this space every day, I wanted to kind of lay the scene of what we see a lot of with the clients that we work with, as well as just the general direction of the market and the things to be considering. And then Michelle is going to show us some of the nuts and bolts of, but how, and what are those tactical steps that she actually took to better integrate climate risk. So right now, the two words on the screen, or the two phrases rather, kind of say it all. What we're seeing is very reactive integration of climate risk. What I mean by that is people don't look at climate risk in acquisitions as an opportunity to push their portfolio more towards a carbon neutral state or more towards a lower carbon state, but rather we want to make sure there's no extreme risks that are going to hit us and cost us money in the next few years. And here's how we look at it. And narrow in scope, a lot of times when you're looking at, okay, how have you integrated climate risk? The one thing people can point to is, well, we look at flood insurance rates because that's part of what we have to do. And yes, that does technically tie into climate. So that's kind of what sets the stage. And if you're in that space, that's absolutely not a problem. Many people are. And what we need to identify today, and what our goal is to just point out what the factors are that you should be looking for that are a little bit more strategic in nature, a little bit more proactive on your part, and of course, where the dynamics are shifting to keep in mind. So a major shift is coming. This is probably not going to be a very controversial statement. Marta had mentioned the melting ice in Greenland back in 2009. Well, we are here in 2022. The IPCC report of 2021 demonstrates that things are becoming more urgent, that we're seeing climate changing on our planet, and that we really do have a real need to be moving to a carbon neutral system and a carbon neutral economy to be able to just sustain how life on Earth is right now. So for that reason, we're seeing carbon neutral goals being set even at the state level within America. So for instance, New York has set state goals by 2050 to have carbon neutrality. Colorado, we're going to begin seeing these pop up likely at state and municipal levels before we see it federally, but that's something to keep an eye on. Also, in light of current events, there's more and more effort to be reducing our independence on oil and fossil fuels as the basis of our energy system. Renewable energies are great because they can be derived from home. They really are based on the resources right around you and what you have accessible to you. There are other regulatory frameworks too. So Marta had mentioned even abroad, of course, things are shaping up here. So things like the EU taxonomy that are beginning to dig into some of the climate risk. The UK actually has its own taxonomy that's almost solely focused on climate risk. And we're seeing other regulatory frameworks begin to be debated. California has a state law, for instance, that's being debated currently in its Senate that would require carbon disclosures. Canada is debating its own taxonomy, as is Australia. So we expect to see regulations at larger levels begin to set in place and really focus down on climate, on how companies are addressing this, and of course, what mitigation efforts are looking like. And then finally, just market dynamics are changing. This is from tenants who are going to be wanting to rent in spaces that do have some degree of low carbon impact or carbon neutrality, or at least a pathway there, as well as local communities, even utility companies looking for less load on the grid and looking for more of a transition. So all of these factors that we see coming, how we talk about carbon neutrality today is going to be wildly different than how we talk about it in 5 years. And it's only going to, I think, increase in momentum and in impact as well too. So what do efforts look like to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the due diligence stage that are more than just tactical? Well, one is certainly accounting for risks, physical risks, beyond flood risks, and there's a lot. So an increase of adverse weather events, for instance, which we can tie to climate, that's going to change based on the region that you're looking for acquisitions in. So you'd want to see things like, has there been an uptick in tornadoes, for instance, here in the Midwest, or extreme snow events, where, while it's almost weird to say, yes, this large slump of snow is tied to global warming, we are seeing these trends in weather patterns, and it does disrupt building operations and where tenants might look at to actually be moving into as well too. So get modeling involved. This would be where you're looking at the full range of climate change, from increased weather impacts to severity, to even things like earthquakes and rising sea levels that could permanently be displacing the building that you're looking at investing in. Physical changes are just one element, though. There are the market changes or the transitional risks. So basically, as we move to a transitional low carbon economy, what are those kinds of risks that are tied in with it, as well as the opportunities? So for instance, what utility providers are doing in a given area is going to change. It's going to, if anyone's seen a map of what our energy grid looks like, it's a nightmare, but there's many different utility players all doing sort of different parts in terms of how they're embracing carbon and a movement to a more carbon neutral future. So make sure that where you're buying has options. I think sometimes it's misunderstood that proper climate risk due diligence means you're only buying the buildings that are already set, already really low emitters, maybe already have renewables on site. That's not the case at all, or even if it was, that's not very realistic for the vast majority of buildings. What you're looking instead is to just understand what tools do you have in your tool belt. As Marta was saying, maybe tie in things like insulation inspections as part of the PCA, so you know just how far do you have to take this building to be able to operate in a lower energy space, so that you won't have to offset as much, or so you won't have to invest in as large of a renewable system to be powering the building, things like that. And make sure that where you're buying has these types of options that are available to you. Understand that there could be a cost associated. So for instance, if there are utility providers that are seeming far, far more reactive than strategic in how they're working towards this, just understand that there may be a cost down the line in when it comes time for you to be more carbon neutral, whether that's from a regulatory standpoint and you might get taxed in the case of New York City, for instance, versus if it's just a cost of inefficient operation in general or tenant choice. And then finally, one element is to have just clear goal setting for when it comes to your portfolio's carbon intensity. I'm a huge fan of intensity measurements as the best way to really wrap your arms around climate risk, because your portfolio is going to change in size. You don't want to be, hampering your own growth just because that technically adds net carbon onto how you perform. So instead, just think through the intensity of a new building. Is this going to be a really carbon intense building? If so, is that some inherent property of the building? For instance, is it really old building stock with poor insulation and an old HVAC system, all of that which would be incredibly costly to replace? Or might there be some other dynamic, maybe the usage of how it's gone on for now? And the key to all of this, I should note, is asking for that data up front so that you're able to analyze it. As Marta says, you could not actually make progress until you know how you're operating. So that becomes a critical part of due diligence as well too. So to drill in just a little bit more, in terms of the market dynamics, I mentioned what are utility companies doing. What renewable credits are available is another important regional concern. So let's say you want to be investing in renewable energy. Understand what those options are. Different parts of the country are actually way better at different types of renewable energy. So for instance, wind power is excellent, but usually does the best in areas that are windy at night and off the coast. So that's where you'll have a lot of nice wind farms set up that you can pull from. Solar power, obviously in our solar Southwest, that's a really good spot to be engaging in those kinds of technologies. And geothermal heating is available just about anywhere, but there's different levels of support for them from both local and statewide regulations and credits, as well as just availability of who's there, who can install it, and who can really help you move in this direction. So understand what providers there are. What do your utility providers offer? For instance, are there power purchase agreements you could enter into that do subsidize with some green energy that you have, as well as, of course, what credits and tax rebates might you be able to get for the investments in these types of systems. So that all gets into things like financing. Look into your purchase options, look into if you produce more solar energy, for instance, can you sell it back to the grid and actually make a bit of money on your investments as well too. All of this, unfortunately, is going to be very regionally dependent. If I had one answer for you across the country, I think it would be a lot easier for people to integrate it to due diligence. But these are just some of the general questions that you can try and check off and try and seek during that admittedly accelerated due diligence time period. So finally, what would state regulations look like? It's not even just renewables. Are there states that are more supportive of things like developing infrastructure for electric vehicles or smart metering, where they're actually making investments on the grid and that will allow it to operate more efficiently even outside of renewables? And of course, what are existing or future mandatory disclosures? Some cities have energy disclosures and they have for years and years, but for instance, is there going to be a tax associated with not operating in a certain way? Or is there going to be any kind of carbon component to it? These are other examples of what you want to look at before you make major investments into a market and certainly into a property as well. So that's kind of the very high level. Hopefully I didn't scare anyone too much with laying out all the factors to consider. And if I did, I believe Michelle will be talking us through a bit how to actually approach this.
Thanks, Kylie. That was awesome. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but a lot of people have bought houses, right? And how many of us would buy a house without doing a home inspection? And that's kind of what we're talking about doing, is we're saying, let's take a look and see what are the elements that may impact the ownership of that home. But we're saying, let's look at what those costs are to operate that home. Let's look at things like the insulation. Let's look at things like, is there water in the basement? Is there a leak? And let's get that stuff addressed before we close. That's the key here, is you're finding out, and you can maybe even work that into the deal to help offset some of those costs. So we've been talking about a lot about the why, but I would like to kind of shift a little bit and talk about the how. So I'm going to pass it over to Michelle and really talk about how to identify and evaluate those reduction opportunities and how this works in practice.
Great. All right, just getting myself set up here. So just a quick overview. I'm Michelle German, our Director of ESG at LBA, and I've been with the company almost coming up on 11 years. I'm currently our head of ESG and in charge of our overall strategy and the program for the entire company. And so just to give you a little bit about LBA so you understand kind of when I'm walking you through our process, like where we're coming from. So we're a privately held real estate or full service real estate investment company headquartered in Southern California. We currently have just a little bit under 100 million square feet of office and industrial product across the United States. And so we've always had a strong focus in ESG for some time now, but just most recently, probably like many of you, we're trying to tackle the path to carbon neutrality. And so we're actively learning what it'll take to get us there, both from a cost and operational perspective. And so just, trying to create the best processes possible out there. And so before I jump into my portion of the presentation, I just wanted to set the stage of where that we're coming from the landlord perspective of what it took to build out the process and identify the reduction opportunities through the due diligence process. And so I think, Marta and Kylie really set the stage of like what we should be thinking about and the reasons, why, but it's a whole nother thing to build the how and then embed it into a company. And so I'm going to do my best to walk you through how I tried to do that. And it's still a work in progress and it's still improving. But at least it's in there and it's happening. And so I feel like that's step one. So with that, I'm going to, really dive in here. And so where do you start and when integrating your decarbonization strategies into due diligence? So first, we had to create a process. And so what we did is we created an internal checklist for our due diligence team specific to each asset type. And so we just wanted to make sure that there was a process that was embedded at the transition kickoff where our required items are part of the process. So when I say our, the ESG team, that the things that we're looking to do are integrated and being contemplated right from the beginning. And so then we have our PCA consultant who's completing our sustainability checklist template. So I think it was Marta maybe that had mentioned that it's one thing to do a PCA, but we need to have it from a lens of ESG. And so the way I kind of try to, bring that all together was creating our sustainability checklist. And then we prepare a climate risk assessment memo during the DD process. We have outside consultants preparing our energy and risk assessment reports. And then I just think it's really important that you identify the right consultants that are subject matter experts that can help you support your objectives. And so then once you're able to get that process embedded into the front end of your due diligence process, you can really start to underwrite carbon reduction initiatives from day one. And so, next slide, sorry about that. There we go. So the next thing, that I think is important after you have the process is really you need to get to know the property. So I think both Marta and Kylie had alluded to this. And so, as I previously mentioned, we have a sustainability checklist, which we complete for each transaction. And so that checklist is completed by our PCA consultant when they're out at the property, and they help us to identify the opportunities and provide high-level recommendations. So let me give you an example of the things that are on our sustainability checklist. Let's just say LED lighting. The checklist is really high level and simple. It's LED lighting, interior, yes, no, not applicable. Here's some comments. So let's say our PCA consultant selects no, there's no lighting. Just at a quick glance, me going through our checklist, I know that we have an opportunity to do LED lighting retrofit at this property. And so I can flag that and say, hey, let's get this into underwriting and budget for that accordingly. So that checklist is more high level, and that's what I use for just like a quick gut check. We also have our climate risk assessment memo. So as part of that process, we generate a climate risk report, and then we flag the high or the medium to high climate risk that we want to assess. And so we then send that report to our PCA consultant, so that when they're out at the property doing their inspection, they're also looking at it again from the ESG lens and this climate risk lens of what was flagged, and they look to legitimize that risk for this specific asset. So when they're on site, they're looking to provide recommendations, if any, on how to mitigate that risk. And at times there might be, we don't think there's a whole lot you need to do to mitigate this risk. So then we prepare a climate risk assessment memo based off of those reports, and we use it as a guide for our operations team to then create their climate risk resiliency plan. So lastly, both the sustainability checklist and the climate risk memo are also used as resources for our operations team, because at the close, they're required to put together their annual ESG action plans. And so having those reports with all that information on there lets them kick off from day one. Hey, what's the low-hanging fruit? What operational and behavioral efficiency should we be looking for? Because we have this data prior to closing that they can go look at. So the other thing we do is we have an energy and risk assessment performed for all of our office properties. So this is done again by an external consultant. And so through that process, before they even can do their assessment, we're really trying to obtain as much data as possible so that the consultant can also get to know the property. So same things that were spoken to earlier, we need to share the building attributes, go to the seller. Can we get your utility data, 12 to 24 months historical if possible? Providing them our PCA. That one's a little tricky because we're doing some of these things at the same time. So I don't know if I have a PCA available yet for when they're going out to do their report. But if I do, I'm going to give that to them. Is there as-built MEP plans that we can share? Are there equipment lists? Any sort of engineering reports that might be helpful? And again, I don't know how, we don't get this too often, but asking the question, hey, can we get your Energy Star profile shared from the seller during DD? It really opens up a whole historical knowledge of, performance and how that property is doing. And so, lastly, some additional strategies that we're trying to contemplate is, assessing renewable energy. Is this a good market for solar? Is there a community solar program available in this market? What's the roof age? So really trying to think through, because I think Kylie had mentioned the markets are vastly different across the country on, good markets for solar, like trying to understand all of those different markets and looking at this specific site and seeing if there's an opportunity. And then really looking at this, is this a good candidate for our smart building program? And, if it is, trying to get the budget and the cost upfront put into the budget if it could be a good candidate. So then, sorry you guys, I'm having trouble getting to my next slide here. There we go. Sorry. Okay, so this next slide is how do we assess the key findings? And so now we have, the knowledge. We have some reports that have come back. We have, different consultant reports, different templates, different checklists. All these things are coming back, and that part can even be overwhelming. And I'll tell you, because I am reviewing and I see a lot of them, it does get overwhelming. But you do have to digest the information, because it's one thing to just get all the information, but if you don't review it and digest it and figure out, getting to this point of assessing the findings, then, you're not going to be able to underwrite any of this. And so, we review our observations and recommendations in the consultant reports regarding efficiency opportunities within the building envelope, lighting, HVAC, controls, on-site power generation, just to name a few of the things that'll be flagged in this report. And so these assessments answer for us: are there any opportunities to create building energy efficiency? What is the building's baseline? How's it performing today? How can we improve that performance? Then we take a look at the net zero pathway. So on one of our reports, it kind of walks us through a net zero pathway, and it tells us, are there energy conservation measures that have been flagged that can support some of this? Is there any end of useful life equipment and potential projects for upgrades? And, again, is there an opportunity for on-site generation? And so then we look at all of these different initiatives that have been flagged from a financial summary component. And so we look at, okay, here's the proposed solutions, and here's the capital costs associated with that. So this report gives us that. This isn't something that I just know off the top of my head and can just go, oh, this is what we're looking, or this is an opportunity, here's the cost associated with it. So this report provides that cost for us, or at least a ballpark of it, right? And then they tell us, what's the annual savings? Are there rebates and incentives available for that specific initiative? And then ultimately, what would our return on investment be? Or how long would it take to get to the payback period? And so then when we have that information, I also have to factor in asset strategy. What's our hold period? Do we have joint venture partners? What's their appetite for ESG? Is this a value add fund, core, opportunistic? So all of these factors have to come into play as we determine what needs to go into underwriting. Because honestly, if I have a 20-year payback period for something that isn't really flagged to be put into our cap grid, I'm going to have a hard time getting that put into capital and approved as a project. So just kind of walking you through my thought process here of what we go through. And then the last piece here is, really how to execute. And so I've already discussed that you have to have a process. We have to have a process, our consultants have to have a process so that we can get to know the property during due diligence. And so when we get all those results back with all the assessments, and we digest that information, we can then underwrite our decarbonization strategies. And so up here on the screen, I have the pathway, to net zero. There's a lot of iterations out there, so I kind of made mine a little different, but this is kind of what we're trying to achieve, is going through this pathway and how to get there. And through the due diligence lens, I'm going to kind of walk you through how I kind of look at this. And so, based on the assessments, it's been documented that we've seen that it's been documented that there's maybe opportunities for plant and equipment upgrades, and they're in line with our asset strategy and budget. And then if so, we need to make sure we get those initiatives into underwriting. So what does that look like? I need to go talk to my DD team, raise my hand. Hey, here's some, initiatives I want to get into underwriting. I need to talk to my engineering team. I need to get them on board to, agree that this is a good decision. I need to talk to the transaction team, get them to agree that maybe it costs a little bit more, but in the long run, this is the right way to go. And so you have to get all of these different stakeholders into the room and have this conversation, and just make sure that everyone knows that these capital items need to be included, or at least contemplated. And so then another focus area for decarbonization, that if you go to the next bucket here, is operational and behavioral efficiency. And so I really believe this area can be a larger focus after closing and once the property transitions to the operations team, but it is a critical step to decarbonization, so I didn't want to leave it off here. And then you have the next opportunity you're looking at, again, is that on-site renewable and solar. So if it's been flagged as an opportunity and it's been vetted and it's something that, hey, this really looks like we can do solar here, then we underwrite it accordingly. If I'm being honest, I find it hard so far to get that much detail and knowledge on the solar piece in enough time to underwrite it. Like, for example, a lot of times it might be more about a rooftop solar lease and a community solar market. And so I might have to put my name in for the lottery, and I don't know if I'm going to get selected, and I'm not positive what my annual revenue might be. And so I'm not going to have them put anything into the budget. But I know on day one that I want to continue down that path to see what that looks like. And so at least I'm hitting the ground running day one versus maybe, several months out, or even a year out. And then lastly, for the offsite renewables and carbon offsets and RECs, technically you could also contemplate these in DD, because you may want to underwrite the premium of green power or even the cost of RECs and offsets. If you already have a carbon neutral commitment and you know the specific date that you're trying to achieve that by, you may want to put that into underwriting. But you also, these initiatives you also can look at down the road as you figure out your pathway and, when your carbon neutral commitment is. And you could always incorporate those into an annual budget when the time comes. And so as you can see, I really highlighted the plant and equipment upgrades and the on-site renewables that need to be contemplated during DD. And that's largely in part because those buckets, to me, have the largest capital outlay. And so if we're able to get those into the budget day one, we have a lot better shot to really get those initiatives going. And so to wrap this up, I'm going to leave you with some takeaways here, just really simple takeaways that I can boil up what I have been talking about here. So I would say you need to have a process. You need to implement and obtain buy-in from your stakeholders. So whether that's the DD team, your transaction team, your engineering team, if it's all of them, whoever, and the executive team, honestly, needs to be involved, because they need to okay the fact that there may be slightly higher costs with certain initiatives that you're trying to push. And so everybody really, there are a lot of stakeholders, even the operations team, who's going to basically take that budget and run with it. Partner with subject matter experts, so people that have that technical expertise to support your goals is very important. And then you need to underwrite those strategies, the decarbonization strategies on the front end before closing, so that, like I said, you can hit the ground running right at closing. And so with that, I will wrap up my presentation. I hope that I gave you some color around, how to embed this into the process and what it looks like. I know that until you're in it, I can't give you like every single detail that it takes or entails, but I hope that this gave you some sort of, foundation to understand like how to start with getting it embedded into the due diligence process. So with that, that's it.
Thanks, Michelle. That was awesome as well. And in case you weren't able to keep up with all of that, because it was a ton of information, just a reminder, we will send out the slide deck after the webinar. There's some awesome strategies on there, but it's a lot of information, a lot to think about. With that in turn, I just want to remind you, if you have any questions, you can put those into the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try to get some questions in here really quick. If we aren't able to get to all the questions, we will follow up after the webinar. The first question that came in is more of a comment, but it's still kind of about the grid and our need to invest in the grid, and it's kind of focused on nuclear power and saying that we need to invest in nuclear power. And I'll kind of kick this to you, Kylie, but I did want to make one comment, because I wrote about this a couple of weeks back on my blog 39 about how nuclear, while there are some advantages to it, we have to keep in mind it takes about 20 years to get a nuclear power plant into operation. So it's not a quick fix. And the cost per megawatt is about $151 per megawatt compared to, offshore wind that's around 49 and solar that's around 41. So there's a cost premium as well. So it's not a magic button. Just to point that out. Did you have any comments, Kylie, or anyone else on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the best arguments for nuclear power is that it doesn't require us to do much work on our grid. It can kind of just plug in to what already exists, but that's not necessarily a good thing either, because our grid is very overpowered. For instance, in theory, if every single person wakes up at 3 a.m. and turns their lights on, their lights will go on. That's not how we need energy to be distributed. So things like microgrids, smart grid technology, that kind of stuff goes hand in hand with renewables to actually move us more towards a carbon neutral future. The other thing about nuclear, while it definitely is more renewable, it is only 97% renewable. We do not have a solution to nuclear waste other than contain it and put it somewhere. So that is just a caveat that comes with this. There's going to be externalities for everything. That's the reality. To produce photovoltaic cells for the solar panels, we need to use energy to do that, and rare earth minerals and things like that. So I'm not trying to say that renewables are completely blind to environmental externalities better or anything like that, but it's more to say that if we are going to be looking for a way to really get onto a more sustainable carbon neutral future, renewables are one of the better ways and one of the faster ways, honestly, of getting there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I almost put it in the same category as like large hydro. There's
Yeah.
a lot of debate on whether it's truly clean or not, because there's a lot of other implications that have to be considered.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is nice to
So-
have that 24/7 carbon neutral power, because battery storage isn't quite ready yet to incorporate all of the traditional renewable energy, wind and solar that we think of. But it's not the be all end all.
Yeah. So I'm going to pitch this one to Michelle, because she snuck in a little secret sauce on her presentation
I
with
did.
with the comment about the Energy Star treasure hunt, which is a super cool program from Energy Star. I'll let you talk about it, Michelle. I know we piloted them where I used to work as well, so they're pretty.
Sure. So, I mean, I could give like a case study, like just high level. At our corporate campus, it's almost a 2 million square foot office campus, and this project is, extremely efficient already. It's one of, our most efficient buildings. And so the team here, the operations and the engineering team, are constantly trying to uncover anything that's left to be done, which there's always things to be done. So I don't want to we still could put solar on, and we're looking at that. But back to the Energy Star treasure hunt, the team, under the operational and behavioral efficiency, I think that's super critical. They went out, the engineers, and went on a night walk, and they'll walk around the property, and they're seeing where their lights turned on, and they're really looking to uncover, things that might seem small, but all those little things start to add up and make, changes. And just think about that on a global scale. If everybody did a treasure hunt to find, these little adjustments that can be made, it seems maybe small at a property level, but at a global level, it's not immaterial. So hopefully that answers the question, but.
Yeah, no, and I'll add, I know when we did it over at Greystar, we would use peer properties to go look at each other's properties, because sometimes you walk by that same light every day and you stop seeing it. So letting somebody else walk your property and see what they see, it's coming for the price of a pizza almost. You can encourage people to go walk each other's properties and really come up with some low cost, no cost, impactful things. Anybody else?
I love that idea.
And this is especially important because, as exciting as it is to talk about the flashier sides of ESG, like renewable energy and climate risk and those big pieces, energy efficiency is so foundational. And sometimes you just need something like a treasure hunt or a reminder that energy efficiency is not only cost effective, but fundamental to improving the performance of your assets. So I love treasure hunts.
Mm-hmm.
Super true, super true. So I'm going to kick this one actually to you, Marta, because the question was asked about advice on integrating ESG into the due diligence process for developers. And as I read that question, the thing that jumps out of me is embodied carbon, but there's certainly some things developers can think about that certainly make it easier when they're selling that asset. Thoughts?
Interesting. So this is due diligence when deciding to develop an asset?
Yeah, I think they're thinking about when you're developing the asset, how should you be thinking about ESG for the due diligence that's going to happen to your property, if I'm reading it right.
All right.
Somebody's going to come look at your property, right? And they're going to want to come buy it.
Well, I mean, I think the more data, the better on all different aspects of ESG. I would say embodied carbon, Chris, you're spot on that when in today's market, a lot of folks are thinking about whole building life cycle carbon emissions of an asset and understanding the embodied carbon that goes into the materials and construction of that asset is something that will be more and more demanded during those turnover periods with disposition. Additionally, they'll want to know estimated energy use intensity. They'll want to know estimated carbon emissions for the site. They'll want to know likely the utility grid makeup of how green or brown it is. They'll want to know just all sorts of aspects that make the operational side of things smoother. And so when we think about the developer's perspective on all of this, having your green building certifications buttoned up to have those clear and able to share, having, as Chris mentioned earlier, your Energy Star portfolio manager account set up to easily pass along and have those operational data running, and having those utility accounts clear, those type of pieces are quite useful.
Yep.
And I could just hop in a little bit too here. So I feel like the development side is like super critical because you kind of have a blank canvas. And so, when LBA has opportunity, well, we have developments, we're going to do a LEED BD plus C. So that, that certification alone kind of gives you ESG or, green initiatives just built into the development side. So you're going to have, more efficient lighting and more efficient really everything if you're going for that LEED designation. So I feel like that is something that is in a way low hanging fruit. Yes, is there a cost associated with it? But in the long term of the property, I feel like it really positions it well. And then just making sure that you're designing it to solar ready, like that it's structurally sound to host those solar panels. And that, if you want to put them on, I mean, and also to that point, looking at should we be ready the second we finish development to put panels on? I have some roofs in Maryland where and New Jersey where we have solar leases signed, and when those are finished being developed, then we're turning around and putting panels right on there. So I feel like those are some things. I'm not sure if that was where someone was going with that question, but things to think about on the development side.
And not even just solar ready, just also electric vehicle charger ready, yes. Like having the conduits in place, having the utility capacity for that electricity in place, and also battery storage ready if you need to think about that utility integration and the space for future battery storage. That all plays into future proofing that asset. I love that, Michelle.
Sure. And to pile on, electrification ready, because there's going to be a transition, and are you going to have a stranded asset? So should you start putting electrical outlets near where you install gas-fired devices, so eventually you can switch them to electric? So,
well, Chris, they should just be all electric from the get-go.
That's true. But the LBA question, do you have consultants review every deal for efficiency opportunities paybacks, or just the older properties where they know the opportunities likely exist as opposed to newer construction?
So we have a little bit different strategy. So on the front end, I had shared that we're office and industrial. So on the office side, we're going to do a detailed analysis every time, no matter what. On the industrial side, so we'll just to stay on the office side. So we do that energy and, risk assessment on all of our office properties. And so that's much more detailed. We're gathering a lot more data. And the reason we do that on the office property is because we're in operational control. So we're going to control all the things that we're going to implement and be doing at that site. So we do that for all office. On the industrial side, we always have that sustainability checklist that I talked about. We're always doing the climate risk memo. And we're, you know, a lot of that falls more on me, honestly, even though the consultant's doing the checklist and helping legitimize the climate risk that's been flagged. A lot of getting things into underwriting on the industrial side falls in line with me. And that's a process I'm actually working through right now, is to not have it fall in line with me, to truly embed that in the process. Here's the guidelines. If this gets flagged, this needs to go into underwriting. And so that's like a piece I'm working through. But anyways, there are two slightly different strategies, but we're always doing analysis and having the consultants do reports. Just one's more detailed than the other.
Sure. Kind of a general question, so I'm not really sure who to push this one to, but it says, what kind of questions should lenders be asking borrowers for ESG? Should lenders be asking?
I can feel that, since we do work with a number of lenders as well too. And the answer is that you really just want to first ask them their approach to ESG. What are their policies that they have in place? If you're able to see their due diligence processes, checklists, an example of a PCA, for instance, those would be good examples so that you can actually understand, is climate risk integrated? If it is it more tactical? Is it more strategic? Is this something we really have to worry about? And then just kind of asking for any data that can be shared if possible. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement to get into, where obviously it helps you understand better in terms of where your money and what the investment is going towards, but it also behooves the borrower to understand that these metrics are important and things that they should get through, because how can they move forward? So I would say I would just start with the higher level conversations, get a baseline of how they're doing things now, and then look from there for opportunities of kind of the low hanging fruit they can incorporate, and then, you know, the fruit that's higher up.
And speaking of the higher fruit, I mean, there is an entire green mortgage kind of structure in the market, where lenders have green mortgage programs like Fannie and Freddie, for example, where there are specific requirements for data sharing, but also energy and water efficiency performance that are tied to reduced basis points on the loan. And those have proven like incredibly effective to drive sustainability in those projects. So if you are a lender who is interested in ESG, maybe think about starting a green loan as well.
Great point. I'm going to try to cram one more in here really quick. I know we're right up against the clock here, but there was a question about what are climate risk models and where do I find those? And just to try to answer that really, really quickly, there's a lot of different models that are out there that are commercially available, but a lot of times also through your insurance or insurer, because honestly, it's kind of an actuary exercise as well, beyond just flood insurance. So those are a couple of places that pop in mind for me to look. Is there's several, without naming names, that are commercially available. There's also through your insurer, there's typically some, even GRESB has a bit of a climate risk assessment in it as well. Obviously TCFD, there are models out there that really jump into that. Did you guys, anybody want to add to that?
My contribution was going to be GRESB's climate risk model, but you're right. There's many out there, so you don't also have to feel like, oh, this is the model for me. It's actually beneficial to go through several models, several approaches at it, to just make sure that you're understanding the breadth of what it encompasses.
Yep. Cool. All right. We are up against time. We really need to get everybody back to their day jobs, but feel free to reach out to any of us if you'd like to continue the conversation. Again, the webinar deck and recording will be coming out after. And for those of you that asked questions and we weren't able to get to them, we'll follow up with those and get you an answer. So thank you guys so much. I really want to thank the panel, the speakers today. Fabulous job by every single one of you. It's been an honor to share the stage with you. Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.